Today, I had a rather amusing experience. I got on a bus, and as I walked toward a seat next to a man, he immediately stood up and offered it to me. It wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary until I said thank you and realized that the man was probably in his 50s. I smiled to myself. Wow, have I really reached the age where someone in their 50s offers me their seat? Of course, I was very grateful to him, but I couldn't help but wonder, how old do I look now? 70, 80? I laughed quietly. That little moment sparked a lot of thoughts about aging, and I thought I'd share them with all of you. Hopefully, we'll have a warm, lighthearted, and meaningful conversation together. Aging, for many, is one of life's most confronting experiences. The gray hairs, the deepening lines, the softening skin, they tell stories we aren't always ready to hear. And in a world that celebrates youth, speed, and surface beauty, growing older can feel like being slowly pushed to the margins. But what if we saw things differently? What if aging wasn't a process of fading, but a slow blooming into a deeper self? Buddhism offers us not just consolation, but profound transformation. Rooted in the teachings of impermanence, compassion, and inner stillness, it invites us to see aging not as loss, but as liberation. In today's video, we're going far beyond cliches. We're going to unpack 5 profound yet practical Buddhist teachings that can change how you experience growing older, not just spiritually, but emotionally and physically too. And in the spirit of mindful healing, I'll share not only insights from Buddhist scriptures and stories, but real experiences from my life and from those I've met along this winding path. Because wisdom doesn't come from knowing, it comes from living. So before we begin, I invite you to pause, breathe, place one hand gently over your heart, and whisper to yourself, I am still becoming, I am still whole. Let's begin our journey into aging with awareness, depth, and grace. Chapter 1. Aging is not a decline, it is a deepening. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha said, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Aging is the clearest mirror of impermanence. But that doesn't mean it's something to fear. In fact, it is the very process that gives life its sacredness. Think of a blooming flower. Would its beauty strike us so deeply if we knew it would last forever? I remember meeting a woman named Sarah during a meditation retreat in Dharamsala. She was in her 70s, a retired school teacher with kind eyes and silver curls. One afternoon, we sat under a Bodhi tree and spoke about aging. She laughed gently and said, my knees creak, my hands shake, but I've never felt so honest in my life. There's no more pretending. That stayed with me. Aging strips away illusions, the need to impress, to compete, to hustle. What remains is clarity, presence, simplicity, but we must be willing to see it. There's a Zen parable I love about an old pine tree and a young cherry blossom. While the cherry tree bursts into beauty briefly each spring, the pine stands tall all year, rough, resilient, and wise. When admired deeply, the pine has its own kind of majesty, not in freshness, but in fortitude. Our culture is obsessed with cherry blossoms, but what if we began to honor the pine? Aging invites us to reflect more deeply, love more freely, speak more honestly, forgive more easily. In our youth, we collect experiences. In our age, we distill wisdom. If you've ever looked in the mirror and felt grief for who you used to be, pause. That younger version of you brought you here, but this you carries all their lessons. That's not loss, that's evolution. So wear your years like a well-worn robe, soft, comfortable, and deeply lived in. This is the beginning of your second flowering. Chapter 2. Honoring the body as a sacred companion. Let us begin this chapter with a deep, reverent breath, not just for the sake of calming the mind, but in honor of the body that breathes it. There is a tender truth in the Buddhist teachings that we often overlook. This body is not a mistake. It is a vehicle for awakening. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha taught that human birth, with its full faculties, is exceedingly rare and precious. The body is not an obstacle to enlightenment, but a sacred bridge toward it. Wrinkles appear, joints ache, our energy softens like a fading breeze at the end of summer. But what if we stopped mourning the body we once had and began celebrating the one we still do? I met a man named Javier, a 64-year-old artist, at a mindfulness seminar in Mexico. He told me, "I used to dance without thinking. Now every movement requires care, and oddly, that's made me love movement even more." That struck me deeply. Slowness isn't weakness. It's an invitation to move with intention. One of the most beautiful metaphors I've come across comes from a Thai monk. He once said, "The body is like an old temple. Some stones are cracked, some colors have faded, but it is wholly still." Our bodies, like that ancient temple, carry sacred wear. They have carried us through grief and celebration, through storms and quiet days. They have been wounded, healed, nourished, and tested, and through it all, they remained. So how do we honor the body as a sacred companion, especially as it ages? Here are 3 Buddhist-inspired reflections. Practice loving attention. Instead of judging your body, try listening to it. What is it asking for today? More water, more rest, more compassion. Each pain or limitation is not a punishment, but a signal calling you inward. Let go of past performance. You are not your previous speed, strength, or stamina. You are the awareness witnessing change. Just as monks bow to the Buddha, you can bow to your body, not because it is perfect, but because it is sacred. Serve the body with kindness. Feed it not out of guilt, but love. Move it not to chase youth, but to express care. Rest not because you're lazy, but because you're wise enough to know when to pause. Aging is not the body's betrayal. It is its gentle request for a new rhythm. And when we move in harmony with it, when we care for it like a beloved elder, we discover that every creak and curve, every spot and scar is part of a sacred symphony. Chapter 3. Letting go of the need to be remembered. It is a quiet fear that lives within so many hearts. The fear of being forgotten. We build, we create, we strive. Deep inside, there's often a hope that what we leave behind will endure, that our names, our stories, our presence will echo after we are gone. But what happens when we begin to realize that the world forgets, that time continues indifferent to our achievements, our memories, even our grief? In the teachings of the Buddha, there is a liberating reminder. The self is an illusion, and in that illusion lies our suffering. We cling not only to possessions or people, but to identity, to the idea of being someone, of mattering, of being remembered. But what if freedom lies not in resisting impermanence, but in flowing with it? There is a story I hold dear, told to me by a forest monk in Sri Lanka. A young novice asked his teacher, "Master, what happens if no one remembers us when we are gone?" The old monk smiled, picked up a bowl of water, and gently poured it onto the earth. "Do you see the water?" he asked. "It touches the ground, disappears into the soil, and becomes part of something larger. To be remembered," he said, "is to stay separate. but to be forgotten is to return fully to the whole. I remember the first time I visited my great-grandmother's grave. I didn't know her name until I read the stone, but in that moment I realized I carry her resilience. Her hands still move through my mother's cooking. Her laugh lives in my aunt. Though her name had faded from memory, her spirit had not. This is what Buddhist teachings invite us to realize. Legacy is not about recognition. It is about resonance. Your name may fade, but your kindness lingers. Your face may be forgotten, but your compassion leaves fingerprints on others' hearts. Reflect for a moment. When you think of someone who changed your life, a teacher, a stranger, a friend, do you remember their full name, or do you remember how they made you feel? The moment they offered grace when you felt lost. The smile that made you feel seen. That's what stays. That's what matters. Chapter 4. Grieving loss, carrying love. Aging brings with it not only the quieting of our own vitality, but also the slow, steady parting of loved ones. Grief, in many ways, becomes a companion in the later chapters of life. Parents pass, friends depart, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with slow sorrow, and no matter how much wisdom we cultivate, no matter how prepared we think we are, the ache of loss still arrives. Tender, sharp, and real. But Buddhism doesn't ask us to suppress grief. It asks us to understand it. In the story of Kisa Gotami, a woman who lost her infant son and sought a cure from the Buddha, we find one of the most compassionate teachings on loss. Kisa was told to bring a mustard seed from a home that had never known death. She searched, desperate, knocking on door after door, but every household had its own story of grief. Eventually, she realized her pain was not unique. It was shared. You are not alone in your grief. Grief is the thread that connects every human heart. Behind every smile in a crowd, there is someone who has loved and lost. And in this shared sorrow, there is also shared strength. But there is a second, quieter truth that Buddhism teaches. Love does not end when life does. I once sat with a woman named Florence who had lost her partner of 38 years. She told me, "I still make tea for him some mornings. I know he won't drink it, but I feel him sitting with me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. That tea, that ritual, was love, still breathing. Grief is not an enemy. It is the proof that love was real. And when we stop trying to get over our grief and instead begin to carry it gently, lovingly, like a cherished photograph, it transforms. Chapter 5. Accepting impermanence in relationships. Of all the lessons aging brings, few are as bittersweet and as necessary as this one. Not everyone is meant to stay. In Buddhist teachings, all things are impermanent, anicca. This truth applies not only to objects and emotions, but to people, to bonds, to every relationship we hold dear. I once had a student named Eric. In his late 60s, he carried deep sorrow from a friendship that had quietly dissolved after decades. "We never fought," he told me. "We just stopped calling." I asked him, "If a bird perches on your windowsill every morning for 5 years, and one day it stops coming, do you blame the bird, or do you thank it for the mornings it gave you?" He paused, and tears came. That's when healing began. Relationships are like rivers. Some flow beside us for miles, others for moments. Their beauty lies not in their duration, but in their depth. Every soul we meet carves something into our journey. Let that carving be a blessing, not a burden. Let your love remain open, even in goodbye. As we arrive at the end of this journey, one of reflection, truth, and soft surrender, let us pause to honor the sacred terrain we've walked together. Aging, when seen through the lens of wisdom, is not a descent, but an unfolding. It is not the dimming of life, but the refining of light. Every line on our skin, every softening of the body, every farewell we've had to make, they are not signs of decay, but of deepening. The Buddha did not teach us to escape change. He taught us to embrace it, not with bitterness, but with clarity, with eyes wide open and hearts unguarded. What if we stopped seeing aging as a loss and began to see it as liberation? Liberation from false standards, from roles we no longer need to play, from the endless chase of youth and the ego's craving for recognition. In aging, we return, not to who we once were, but to who we truly are. I think of my grandmother, who in her final years laughed more than she ever had before. She no longer worried about appearances. She spoke her truth kindly but firmly. She cried during movies. She sat still for long stretches without needing to explain herself. In those quiet moments, I realized she was more herself than ever. That is the gift of growing older. We begin to live not for applause, but for authenticity. So, dear listener, if you are standing at the edge of a new decade, or feeling the weight of time on your bones, remember this: you are not fading, you are emerging. You are not behind, you are becoming. You are not less, you are more deeply yourself. Let the wisdom of impermanence guide you to peace. Let the tenderness of loss remind you how fiercely you have loved. Let the stillness of solitude teach you the richness of your own company. Aging is not something we deal with, it is something we honor. Let each year be a soft prayer. Let each gray hair be a strand of moonlight. Let each goodbye be a gate that leads you back to yourself. In the words of the Buddha, as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame. May you age not just with grace, but with freedom, with clarity, with kindness for yourself and compassion for all beings walking this same path. And as you continue forward, know that you carry not just years, but wisdom, not just memories, but meaning, not just change, but a deep, quiet truth, that everything is impermanent, and that's what makes it sacred. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Until next time, breathe gently, and remember, you are not growing old, you are growing real.